It is your right and responsibility every 4 years to give someone temporary custody of this office and of the institution of the presidency. You so honored me, and I'm grateful. Grateful and proud of what together we have accomplished. We have made a new beginning. Vice President Bush and I would like to have your continued support and cooperation in completing what we began 3 years ago. I am therefore announcing that I am a candidate and will seek re-election to the office I presently hold.
President Ronald Reagan, running for a second term, already celebrates the successes of his first.
This is America, spring of '84. And this is America. And this is America. And this. And this. And this, too, is America. Just 4 years ago, people were saying its problems were too big and too difficult to be handled by any one president. Yet what do we see now? Jobs are coming back. Housing is coming back. And for the first time in a long time, hope for the future is coming back. And isn't it interesting that no one anywhere is saying the job of president is too big for one person? President Reagan. He's doing what he was elected to do.
Ronald Reagan, the 40th President of the United States, has a dream for his country. His dream of happy, affluent, hard-working people is reflected in his campaign commercials. He seeks a world at peace while increasing the military might of the United States to combat what he sees as the threat of the Soviet Union and spreading communism. As incumbent president, he has many advantages in his campaign, even though he is also the oldest president ever, and his critics raise questions about his health and age. But he's also the personification of the American dream, proof, according to some, that anyone can become president. Ronald Reagan was born 73 years ago in Tampico, Illinois. His family were poor, his father an itinerant salesman with a drinking problem. Reagan paid his own way through college, where he was renowned for his efforts on the sports field. His first job was as an announcer on an Illinois radio station, utilizing his now famous voice. From there, he went to Hollywood to make movies. One of them was The Hasty Heart, made in 1949.
What's on your mind?
Have you ever been in love?
With bells on.
Well, when was the first time you knew?
Oh, I'd say the first time I kissed her. Hey, you're not asking me to tell you about the bees and flowers, are you?
There are certain things that are as well known in Scotland as anywhere else.
I'm glad to hear it. I'd hate to see the Scots die out.
But about this kissing, when a good girl kisses you, it's an encouraging sign, is it not?
Well, good or bad, it's encouraging any way you look at it.
Aye.
During his career as an actor, he made 50
Tell me,
films,
do you think I
mostly
have the right
comedies
to
and
ask a lass to be my
romances.
wife?
But he was also president of the
Well, look,
Screen
Buster,
Actors Guild
you
for
don't mean-
6 years
Aye.
and
Bonnie
a
sister
paid-up
Baka.
member of the Democratic
Wait a
Party.
minute, Lackey. Everybody falls in love with his nurse. It's natural. Well, I bet every patient in that ward has been in love with the sister for a while, including me.
By 1965, Reagan had swapped acting for politics and become the Republican contender for the California governorship. His switch to conservatism had come during the Cold War era of the 1950s. By 1966, he was the Republican governor of California. In 1968, he wanted the Republican presidential nomination, but was beaten by Richard Nixon.
I hereby and proudly move on behalf of my fellow Californians that this convention declare itself as unanimously and united behind the candidate Richard Nixon as the next president of the United States, and I so move.
Reagan won support for his good grace in defeat, and in 1976 he tried again against President Ford, but he lost and refused Ford's offer for the vice presidency. In 1980, he won on the first ballot and went on to defeat President Jimmy Carter. He'd finally reached the top.
I, Ronald Reagan, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
After the applause came the reality. The country was unhappy with the record of the Carter administration. Americans gave President Reagan a clear mandate: control inflation, reduce unnecessary government interference in their lives, and reassert America's influence in the world. Reagan promised them he would change the face of government and improve the tone of American society. The core of his program was a mixture of tough economic policies that came to be known as Reaganomics. The main aim, to balance the books. His work as president had barely started when he was gunned down by a psychologically disturbed John Hinckley. Ironically, President Reagan takes a hard stand against tightening up the country's gun laws. A .22 caliber bullet narrowly missed the president's heart but lodged in his lung. His press secretary, Jim Brady, was seriously injured after being struck in the head, and a policeman was also hurt. Much to the delight of Americans, President Reagan made a remarkable recovery. He left hospital just 10 days after the shooting with warm greetings from well-wishers. His courage brought a resurgence in support and helped him steamroll his economic program through Congress. But his popularity was short-lived in some quarters. Employers were taking a hard line in pay negotiations, and air traffic controllers went on strike in August for better pay and conditions. Reagan refused to give in to their demands and fired them all. The move set a precedent in trade union relations, with workers the losers and bosses gaining new confidence. Recent report says the air traffic industry is still suffering from Reagan's decision, and trouble is again brewing over their working conditions. While there is little doubt that the economy is now recovering, Reagan's critics say he has pampered the rich and betrayed the poor. The unemployment figures are shrinking, and inflation is down to about 5%. Most Americans are enjoying a higher standard of living because of reduced taxes and increased earnings. But recent figures show more Americans are now living below the poverty line. While some rely on food from soup kitchens, President Reagan makes no apologies about increasing military spending.
When I took office in January 1981, I was appalled by what I found. American planes that couldn't fly and American ships that couldn't sail for lack of spare parts and trained personnel and insufficient fuel and ammunition for essential training. The inevitable result of all this was poor morale in our armed forces, difficulty in recruiting the brightest young Americans to wear the uniform, and difficulty in convincing our most experienced military personnel to stay on. There was a real question then about how well we could meet a crisis, and it was obvious that we had to begin a major modernization program to ensure we could deter aggression and preserve the peace in the years ahead.
President Reagan pledged to spend billions of dollars building up military power. He reactivated projects that had been shelved and embarked on new ones. There is new research going on into a so-called Star Wars project on how outer space could be used in modern warfare. The guiding philosophy behind all this expenditure is President Reagan's insistence that the only chance for real peace is military balance between the Soviet Union and the United States.
We live in a world in which total war would mean catastrophe. We also live in a world that's torn by a great moral struggle between democracy and its enemies, between the spirit of freedom and those who fear freedom. In the last 15 years or more, the Soviet Union is engaged in a relentless military buildup, overtaking and surpassing the United States in major categories of military power, acquiring what can only be considered an offensive military capability. All the moral values which this country cherishes, freedom, democracy, the right of peoples and nations to determine their own destiny, to speak and write, to live and worship as they choose, all these basic rights are fundamentally challenged by a powerful adversary which does not wish these values to survive. This is our dilemma, and it's a profound one. We must both defend freedom and preserve the peace. We must stand true to our principles and our friends while preventing a Holocaust. The Western commitment to peace through strength has given Europe its longest period of peace in a century. We cannot conduct ourselves as if the special danger of nuclear weapons did not exist. But we must not allow ourselves to be paralyzed by the problem, to abdicate our moral duty.
May Day celebrations in Moscow, capital of what Reagan calls the evil empire. He sees its influence everywhere and says the only way it can be controlled is by matching strength with strength. Equality brings deterrence, he says. The defense of so-called spheres of influence has been another major Reagan platform. U.S. troops went into the Lebanon to oversee the departure of the vanquished Yasser Arafat and his Palestine Liberation Organization. When they left, the Syrians stepped up their role in Lebanon, so American troops went back. They got caught up in the Civil War. Syria is the Soviet Union's strongest ally in the Middle East. Reagan is determined that Soviet influence in the area will not be allowed to grow. But the Lebanon involvement has led to what's been termed Reagan's biggest foreign policy fiasco. The Marines were put under fire, but as peacemakers, they weren't allowed to retaliate. However, under increasing pressure, the massive guns of the U.S. battleship New Jersey opened fire on the Shuf Mountains above Beirut. The U.S. was no longer seen as the impartial observer. But the real blow to U.S. involvement came on October the 23rd last year. Suicide squads attacked the American and French headquarters. 241 U.S. and 58 French soldiers died. Vice President George Bush was sent to view the devastation. Most Americans had little understanding of the Lebanese situation or America's involvement, but the damage caused by these explosions brought home the reality. Soon after, promises of support for the Lebanese government of Amin Jamal were shelved. The U.S. forces were pulled out in July, leaving a divided and devastated country.
We had your Prime Minister
leaving
in Washington
Syria and the
last
Soviet
week,
Union to further increase their influence.
And that was before all this, but I wish I was.
Within days of the bombings, the United States became involved in another battle on the Caribbean island of Grenada, brought about partly by the building of this runway. Reagan was convinced the island was a Soviet-Cuban colony being readied as a military base to, as he said, export terror and undermine democracy. He and other Caribbean nations ordered troops to land on the island. Reagan strenuously denied this was an invasion. He says it was a rescue mission to repatriate about 1,000 Americans living here. Whatever the reason, the American troops, after several days of fighting, quashed resistance, rounded up Cuban workers, and sent them home to Cuba. The United States action in Grenada won wide support at home, but was bitterly criticized abroad, and called attention once again to the United States' role in Central America. President Reagan has used the Soviet-Cuba link to justify the U.S. actions in other parts of that area. Closer to home, Reagan sees Nicaragua as the so-called cancer of Central America. He says it mustn't be allowed to grow. He alleges the Soviets are exporting communism to the continent via Cuba and its support for the Nicaraguan government. Reagan is determined to see the downfall of the Sandinista government and has been providing funds for right-wing rebels operating out of neighboring Honduras. This support and the huge military exercises around Nicaragua are producing results. Nicaraguan leader Daniel Ortega has offered to take part in direct talks with Washington, proposed a mutual non-aggression pact with its neighbors, and is to hold elections in November. But Reagan has been criticized for sponsoring unrest in another country. That sponsorship, though, is likely to continue. Reagan fears Nicaragua has designs on its neighbors, and his main concern lies here in El Salvador. Washington has poured billions of dollars in military and economic aid into the country to help it in its fight against left-wing guerrillas. Reagan insists the rebels in El Salvador are being helped by Cuba through Nicaragua. He fears the so-called domino effect. With the help of Nicaragua, El Salvador could fall into communist hands, toppling other governments, possibly as far north as Mexico, next-door neighbors to the United States. terrorism worldwide continues. The United States counts its dead and wounded. During Ronald Reagan's presidency, critics say, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States have reached an all-time low. Washington imposed sanctions on the Kremlin for its involvement in Poland. American technology, which was to be used in the building of this pipeline in Siberia, was blocked, much to the rage of European allies. The embargo was later lifted because of their anger. But the president kept up his support of solidarity and made a movie which was beamed into Eastern Europe to show support for the Polish people.
We, the people of the free world, stand as one with our Polish brothers and sisters. Their cause is ours. We call for an end to repression and a return of basic internationally guaranteed human rights in Poland.
Relations between the two superpowers plummeted last year when a South Korean commercial airliner was shot down by a Soviet fighter. Only the wreckage was found. 269 people died, including Koreans, Japanese, and Americans. The airliner was way off course and over Soviet territory. The Kremlin said it was on a spying mission for the United States. Washington denied that, and the international community condemned the Soviet Union's action. President Reagan went to China in April, determined to get Chinese help in his battle of words with the Soviets. He was treated like royalty, but the Chinese weren't keen to be drawn into a common stand with the United States. The visit did, however, prove to his critics that while President Reagan remained at loggerheads with the Soviet Union, he was able to deal effectively with the world's other big communist power. And President Reagan does keep talking of his willingness to resume talks with the Soviets, particularly in the area of arms limitation. Earlier this year in Geneva, these talks stalled when the Soviet delegation walked out.
Vitinsky, can you tell us, did you walk out longer?
Состоялось заседание. Мы в ходе этого заседания заявили о прекращении нынешнего раунда переговоров.
That the present round of the negotiations is discontinued
без установления какого-либо срока их возобновления.
Without any date set for their resumption.
President Reagan regretted the breakdown of the talks.
I don't think that I'm surprised by what they did this morning, but I am disappointed. I can't believe that it is going to be permanent. We'll be ready to continue negotiations at any time that they want to come back.
The Geneva talks center around the deployment of missiles in Europe. NATO has decreed that Pershing and cruise missiles will be installed throughout Western Europe because of the deployment of the Soviet SS-20 missiles in Eastern Europe. NATO told the Soviets that the deployment wouldn't be necessary if the Kremlin removed the SS-20s. The Kremlin refused, and the deployment of the U.S. missiles went ahead, much to the anger of Europe's peace movement. President Reagan wasn't impressed by the peace movement's arguments against deployment.
They seem to think they have a simple answer to warfare, that if we just lay down our weapons and stand back empty-handed, that somehow peace will come to the world. They haven't stopped to figure it might be the peace of the grave.
And so, in an air shuttle operation, the missiles began arriving at the Greenham Common Air Base in Britain. Though Reagan may have got an agreement on the deployment of the U.S. missiles, on other issues he didn't. At this economic summit meeting in London, President Reagan and his government came under attack for some of its policies. European governments are becoming increasingly sharp-tongued about the level of American interest rates. They create problems internationally, particularly for third world countries. And there's pressure on Mr. Reagan to get them down. These differences were forgotten as Reagan and some of his European allies went to France to mark the 40th anniversary of D-Day. The President and the First Lady toured the sites of historic battles and once again paid tribute to United States dead. It was also an emotional time when the Reagans went to Ireland to visit the President's so-called ancestral home in Ballyporeen. The cynics said the Reagan campaign for presidency had begun with the wooing of the Irish vote. The media loved it, and hours of pictures were transmitted home as President Reagan found his roots.
Of all the honors and gifts that have been afforded me as president, this visit is the one that I will cherish dearly. You see, I didn't know much about my... I didn't know much about my family background. Not because of a lack of interest, but because my father was orphaned before he was 6 years old. And now, thanks to you and the efforts of good people who have dug into the history of a poor immigrant family, I know at last whence I came. And this has given my soul a new contentment, and it is a joyous feeling. It is like coming home after a long journey.
The 1984 election campaign is now underway. The first official stop for President Reagan and Vice President Bush was Austin, Texas. The Republicans loved the president's partisan approach, and protesters were kept out. He attacked the Democrats as big spenders, which he says would mean a big increase in taxes. But though Reagan and Bush enjoyed their time on the presidential ranch, they're going to have a hard time convincing the electorate that their balancing of the budget will be much better.
Walter Mondale is not telling the truth. I've said it before, and I will say it again, and no matter how many of you try to put in a hedging line, we have no plans for, nor will I allow any plans for, a tax
Washington
increase.
spent $185 billion more than it earned this year. This from a president who promised to balance the books when he was elected.
Haven't told me yet.
The Republicans must also woo the black voters. Blacks have been badly hit by the budget cuts. A disproportionate number of blacks live below the poverty line. In the past, most haven't even bothered to vote. But the Democrats, and in particular the Reverend Jesse Jackson, have mobilized more blacks than ever to register. When they vote Democratic. The Republicans must consider their voting power. The other influential group Reagan must listen to, women. They make up 53% of the electorate, and many want change. He was warmly welcomed by these Republican women, but others aren't so happy. They see his blocking of the Equal Rights Amendment as proof he doesn't have the interest of women at heart. President Reagan disagrees.
We Republicans have always been in the forefront of supporting women's rights and encouraging their participation in all shades of society.
Women traditionally vote Democratic, and this year they have the added attraction of Geraldine Ferraro on the Democratic ticket. Maureen Reagan doesn't believe this will make any difference to her father's campaign.
We have a group of elected women in Washington today, Republican elected women, and they feel very strongly that we are indeed going to win this election in November. They're very proud of the fact that there is a woman on the other ticket, but it isn't going to drag us over there.
The one woman President Reagan does pay attention to is his wife, Nancy, seen here at the London Zoo. Some see her as his most influential advisor. President Reagan comes under fire in some quarters for the role he allows Nancy to play in state affairs and for his reliance on his advisors. His critics say he's a lazy president who prefers to spend time holidaying on his California ranch instead of running the country. President Reagan dismisses such criticism as unfair.
I started something in California with the cabinet that I brought here. And that was that it's a kind of a board of directors operation. We sit around the cabinet table as we're sitting here. And instead of just the one person, if he thinks that, well, it's his agency problem, and he's the only one can speak on that. No, everybody has a pitch in, and we sit there and we discuss and sometimes argue, and it goes around the table and around, and when I finally heard enough to finalize my own decision, I make the decision, and that ends the discussion on that. If I haven't, if it's something that's so tough that there's so much right on both sides, send them away to come back the next day, and we'll take it up again. And maybe that has led to this. I've noticed that it's always from those unidentified White House informants that this conversation comes.
Ronald Reagan is the oldest United States president ever. He turned 73 this year, and Nancy celebrated the occasion at one of her husband's news conferences.
It brought it down to 5%, and we are holding it to 7%. Honey, you were getting laughs.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you. How old are you?
And 2 days early. Aren't they coming fast enough without moving it up?
Hold the candle out. Make a wish.
You should know what I'm wishing.
It's easy enough to guess, sir. It's easy enough to guess.
But President Reagan's age and health are less of an issue in this campaign. Of major concern is the economy. Reagan's critics say the cake is not being fairly divided. The rich are getting the biggest bits. Poor are getting the crumbs. And the cake hasn't been paid for.
You're not getting too old to run again, are you, sir? You're not getting too old to run again, are you, sir?
It's a cake, Sam.
What kind is it? Did you bake it yourself?
As a matter of fact, Sam, since she
President Reagan may have won the support of his Republican Party, but he'll have to convince the voters in November that he should continue to supervise the cutting of the cake.
It's just the 31st anniversary of my 39th birthday, and I'm enjoying every one of them.